Welcome to HR Voices, a podcast for independent HR and people professionals and the businesses they support. HR Voices is brought to you by the expert team at HR Independence Limited. We hope you enjoy.
Hi everyone, and welcome to the latest edition of the HR Voices podcast. It's lovely to have you back with us. I'm joined as always by my lovely colleague Mary Asante. Hi Mary.
Hi Charlotte. Hello everyone.
Today we are going to be joined by Anthony Munday, and we've agreed that he likes to be called Tony, but if you want to find him on any other platform, it's Anthony Munday, and he is the Maverick Mediator. And so what we're going to be discussing with Tony today is why mediation is the best form of conflict resolution and how you can work sort of for a win scenario to mend broken down relationships in workplaces. So this is going to be a really interesting conversation, I think, because if you think about the whole grievance and sort of disciplinary situation, mediation is a common recommendation. So I'm quite interested to hear what Tony's got to share with us today. So Tony, would you like to just give a little introduction about you and your business?
Okay, yeah, thanks so very much, and hello to everyone who's watching and listening. Yeah, so the very abbreviated version. I had a 34-year police career as a senior leader, but I was also an internal mediator. That's where I learned about the challenges of being an internal-based mediator. So subsequently, I'm now a formerly ACAS accredited workplace mediator. And as I'm a maverick thinker, that was the polite term in the police because I had a coaching style of leadership. I've adopted that, for the current website. And also with my maverick thinking, what that's about is I always think, can we do things better? Why are we doing things? So as we'll get into, I've actually, if it doesn't sound too grandiose, enhanced the ACAS process of mediation for the benefit of traumatized clients. And I know that sounds a bit strong to talk about traumatized people, but my experience is that these people have been in conflict in the workplace quite often for years. So they absolutely are traumatized. And it was because of my police stroke detective background I had that I recognized the importance of doing things a bit better for those participants.
Great stuff.
Right. Thank you for that introduction, Tony. As Charlotte said, looking forward to this discussion. But for people listening, conscious that in the workplace, in the industry, in our industry, we throw buzzwords around a lot. And sometimes people think, oh, I understand what that means. And other times it's like, oh, I'm not sure, but I'll just go with the flow. So for the purposes of everyone listening, what is mediation? Well,
right. That's actually a really good question because there's lots of different forms. But so I'll be talking about workplace mediation. Okay. So workplace mediation for me is where a number of people in conflict, and again, I always use the term participants. So a lot of lawyers and other colleagues who've been trained by lawyers talk about the word parties. I think that's very adversarial, so I don't use that. So essentially, the process is people who've been in workplace conflict, facilitated by me, in this case, start to understand each other as people, which probably sounds a bit bizarre, but that's the reality. When people are really entrenched in conflict, they don't see each other or a number of people, because I work with conflicted teams as well, don't see each other as people. And the real value of a mediation ultimately is that it helps to repair, I think, as you indicated, Charlotte, broken and fractured business relationships, both between people and within the organization. That's really important. And my experience is that mediation is the only form of conflict resolution that will actually do that. And part of the other element is that the previously conflicted participants are actually working together to design a future sustainable, positive outcome that works for them both once they've explained to each other their perspectives on what the conflict's actually all about, and most importantly, the human impact on them. So it's a very emotional and intense process, which actually becomes therapeutic and cathartic, I would say.
Great, thank you for that, Tony. So in the workplace, when a conflict arises, when might one spot that mediation might be the way forward for them?
Right. So the first thing, so it's, again, and it is a really good question, is my take is the earlier the conversation, the better. As I've said, my experience, sadly, is that too often when I'm meeting conflicted people, they're traumatized because this stuff has gone on for years. All right. So procrastination isn't just a thief of time. It actually mitigates against what, people and culture, HR team should be about. So the earlier the conversation, the easier it is to diffuse. So I would say, so there's a little phrase I use that it's about transforming difficult conversations into a healthy dialogue. The earlier the conversation, then anything's possible. The longer we leave things, they get more entrenched, more intense, more significant. And of course, there's other consequences, both within the workplace. And of course, people also have what I call real lives. So when they go home, and it's like a little circular process, backwards and forwards, comes really intense in both areas. And of course, people then will go sick, they can leave, all sorts of consequences. So for our HR colleagues there listening, those early conversations will be really critical, really important.
Thanks, Tony. And you talk about turning a conflict into a dialogue. And I'm sure both Charlotte and I have come across situations where the participants or potential participants in that conflict resolution process may dread coming into the workplace because they wouldn't want to bump into the individual. They can't bear being in the same building sometimes as the person, let alone sit in the same meeting or have a conversation about a project that sometimes they might be working together on. So the impact on the workplace can be huge, and it can become very visible to colleagues who probably might not be aware what is going on, that something isn't quite right here. So the ability to be able to use mediation as a tool to turn that into a dialogue which can lead to a potential desired resolution for both participants is actually quite great and quite powerful in that sense. And if somebody who's not been through a mediation process before, either as an employer not engaging a mediator before, or a potential participant thinking, what might that look like if I agree to go into mediation? What might I expect?
Okay, so right, so I think I mentioned my Maverick thinking and my police background, and if I explain it this way, so pretty much most other workplace mediators, the first time they meet the participant, and quite often they'll use the term party, is for what's called the individual meeting. In other words, as soon as they meet the person, almost instantly or within a very short period of time, they're supposed to develop rapport, trust, and confidence. Now, I think that's completely unrealistic because there's degrees of superficiality with the response. So this is what participants have told me. So going back to my police experience, so when I was interviewing victims, witnesses, and suspects, I didn't just dive in and say, tell us all about it. It was really important because quite often these people, for various reasons, were traumatized, right? So I would develop rapport with them in different ways. So they had trust and confidence in me. So I recognize that. And again, I hope it doesn't sound too arrogant for the people at ACAS, because they're not the only ones, that I thought, right, we need to separate out the process of developing rapport, trust and confidence in the process and me, for exactly the reasons you've been talking about, Mary, as a completely separate process. So I have what I call an icebreaker stage. So I meet one-on-one with the participant. We do not talk about the mediation matters. Now, quite often, as I say, these people are traumatized. And then with the background I've got, I can recognize that. So I'm looking for all the things you would know about body language, tone of voice, etc. So the whole process is to diffuse that trauma. And then once that has occurred, it's then a lot easier to then talk about how the process will work. And that means that when we meet either the following day, it's never the same day because people need to process all this, then we're not meeting as strangers. One of the other points you'd mentioned, Mary, which is quite true, is that sometimes organisations will almost try to design timeframes so that people don't meet, work from home and all these things, which amplifies the problem because you're avoiding it. So once we have the individual meeting and the formerly traumatized people are able to talk in depth in ways they always tell me they would never have done in a month of Sundays if we'd met for the first time, is the concern that you talked about of actually being in the same room as the other participants or participant. So one of the aspects of ACAS accredited mediation is that we create what are called ground rules. That's basically to create a situation where there's respectful listening. So over the course of time, I've probably developed 20 aspects that indicate and will confirm respectful listening, but I always present those in the individual meetings as a draft. So that's the participant gets the opportunity, of course, to see if they feel it's defective, if there's any other aspects they would like introduced to give them that trust and confidence, because that's what the ground rules do. They actually enable people who formerly, as you said, absolutely can't stand the sight of each other. And it isn't just internally, because a lot of clients have come as a result, and these are senior people who've performed, shall we say, in conflict in meetings with other organizations. And then it's CEOs of other organizations that have then got in touch with their organization to say, what's going on with your people? So this is really important. And those ground rules, facilitated by me, enable people who principally have not been able to stand the sight of each other, let alone be in the same space, to actually do so, and then ultimately to work together, because that's really another important stage, to create what we call a written agreement, which defines in writing the different aspects of how things are going to be. And within that written agreement as well, it covers clearly the personal aspects, i.e. people will be respectful, etc., in all their communication. But once we've dealt with that, there's also the elements of what have been the drivers, frankly, in the organisation that have contributed to the conflict in the first place. So this is, as it were, intelligence that's come from the participants working together, what they tell me. So that then gets recorded as part of the written agreement. Now, why that's quite important is that we should say it's a fundamental aspect which I hadn't mentioned, is that mediation is completely confidential. That's a really important bit. So I apologise to anyone listening and watching. I should have said that straight away. So anything that's said within a mediation is confidential. However, the written agreement can be shared with the unanimous agreement of participants. So invariably they do. So to people like HR business partners, HR directors, line managers, etc. So it's actually a form of moral contract, but it's a little bit more than that, because it's almost brings a degree of governance, so people know how things are going to be. And if we then get on to talk about the review stage, what I'm then able to do, because of course with the permission of the participants, they've put in writing some organisational aspects that have exacerbated or contributed to the conflict that they'd like the organisation to be aware of. And then that's delivered by me when I then meet the people who it's been shared with. So that's very powerful learning that goes back into the organisation on a non-attributable basis. Clearly, if there's 2 participants, it's clear there's 2 people who've agreed that, but quite often I've worked with 5s and 6s of people. But because it's well stated without personal rancor, if you will, it's really good. And I always use the word business intelligence for the organisation, so HR colleagues and other line managers, to pick up what these themes are, then to actually design out the potential for future conflicts, not just for those participants, but for others. So apologies, that's a bit of a long-winded answer.
It's interesting though, because listening obviously with your background, how your background comes out in what you're doing now. You know, you say it's collecting business intelligence and it's, you know, it's learning for the future. And so it's really lovely to hear how that threads through. And I think that's probably an element that maybe Mary and I might not have come across before, you know, that obviously you get your agreement and agreed ground rules moving forward of how you're going to behave with each other. But that's quite interesting to have that additional element of the actually how can the organisation, or how has the organisation fueled this, and how could they not do that in the future? That's really good feedback to have. I wanted to just touch on the whole emotion piece, because obviously your pre-meets hopefully break down some of the emotion, but much when you talk about these sort of conflicts that have longevity to them and have gone on for a long time, there's a point, isn't there, really, where actually most of what happens from a certain point onwards is purely based on the emotion of the situation.
Yeah, and I won't go into too many case studies, but I think one is really instructive an aspect. So it involved 6 senior people in an organisation, and then I met one of the persons, okay, and she was clearly terrified and really traumatized. And what she then said, after I'd given an outline, you know, just to said I can recognise, you know, that this is extremely challenging for you. What she said was this. She said, right, I'm 35 now. She said, the word mediation, since I've been 17, has terrified me. And what it was, when she was at school, she was being badly bullied. And so the headmaster said, right, we'll have some mediation. So I said, what did that look like? She said, we went to the headmaster's office. He sat in a corner. I sat opposite the bully. And I said, what happened then? She said, for an hour, the bully shouted and swore at me. At the end of the hour, the head teacher looked at his watch, said, mediation's over. I said, well, what happened then? She said, we went outside and the bully beat me up. So she said, the first thing I've got to say is, thank God that wasn't mediation. And you could see her whole state, I know it sounds dramatic, but it's true, actually melting away. And so it's a powerful illustration that, you know, other colleagues who do other things, and that's fine for them. But my experience is you can't have, and you've used the word emotion, Charlotte, you cannot have true rapport with people who are in an extremely emotional, traumatized state. That's just not possible. And again, because the reality is, if you like, I suppose I could almost say I'm called in as a fire brigade, all right, when things have really, you know, almost the house has burnt down for people. So this has been ingrained in them for years, right? So you've got to be respectful for that and help clarify for them it's going to be different how the process operates. But most important, listen to them, because it's not a lecture, it's absolutely two-way of rapport building so that they are in a really good place. And then the individual meeting in the structure that I adopt is always at least the following day. And that gives people time to really reflect and diffuse and to really consider how much they want to say. Because again, the feedback they give me, and this probably apply to a lot of our HR colleagues listening is that people can choose the depths to which they engage. So quite often, and I'm only talking about the people that I've met directly, they will engage superficially, if at all, with internal based mediators because they do not trust the confidentiality element. And as we know with HR colleagues, people and cultures, it's now developing into, and I certainly knew that when I was employed in the police, HR keep a little file on everybody, all right? There's the official file, you can see you smiling, and there's the little black book, all right, or the little black folder. So it's inordinately difficult and unnecessarily difficult for internally based mediators to actually get to the real core of the issue. However, for me, the real value of people within organizations, line managers, HR colleagues, understanding mediation is that they can listen out for all sorts of cues and clues, and they're able to explain it and frankly then pass the baton on. All right, because the reality is, and I've had it, my own experience where there was a scenario, and this was in the police, admittedly, but with a HR business partner was mediating between himself and another senior colleague. And within an hour, when I got back to another business unit, people were telling me what had been going on. All right. So that was the end of any interest by me in internally based mediation as far as it concerned me. And another most recent example would be quite interesting. So again, these were two senior people. So this is a couple of months ago. This scenario had been going for 6 years. The issues we won't talk about, but one of the participants felt it was a waste of money to go for an external mediator. So we've got internally based mediators. The other, for the reasons about confidentiality, said no. So when we was having the icebreaker with that person who was just, skeptical of the value of an external mediator, she didn't hold back. I mean, she's a very strong-willed person. And she said, well, why is the organisation paying all this money to you? I said, well, it's not a huge amount. I mean, it's effective. This is appropriate. But I said, the reason is that what we say is completely confidential. So I said, right, what dealings do you have with the people who are internal mediators in your organisation? And they're all HR people. He said, oh, well, we go for coffee and all. I said, great. So you're working together, but the process is about confidentiality. Your colleague doesn't trust that that confidentiality is going to be respected. So for a number of reasons, this conflict between you has deteriorated for 6 years. And these people were formerly friends, used to go to McDonald's for breakfast, etc. So said, well, okay, well, I'll give it a try. And she said, just to confirm, this is all voluntary, so I can leave at any time. I said, well, of course, absolutely. And then when we'd gone through the whole cycle, so I was then doing the review, which is the stage after the joint meeting, she actually said, I really understand now the difference between having an awareness of the process and actually being able to deliver it in a way that people will really believe that it respects the confidentiality of that process.
Thank you, Tony, for that. And you've touched on a couple of things that I would like to explore a little bit. The first is confidentiality. And I think it's important that we touch on and discuss that confidentiality and what it might look like, because you've touched on a number of case studies. And with somebody listening who might go, ooh, if it's confidential, why are you discussing it as a case study type thing? But more importantly, if someone is going through mediation, and I know, maybe, and Charlotte knows as well, that yes, these conversations are confidential, but for people working especially within very small organizations, they can be quite anxious when they are told that anything is confidential, because like your experience where by the time you leave the room, everyone knows what was said because walls have ears, and then knows what's going on even before the meeting finishes. How can they be assured of confidentiality?
Right. So So the first thing is that and understandably, both all the people listening, let alone yourselves, right? You do not know if the sex of what I've described is correct or anything, right? So there's no way in the world, because I ever really sort of have recommendations directly. It's not like, if I'm a plumber, then you say, yeah, Fred Smith or Frida Smith did a fantastic job. No, not at all. But I used that, I call it a case study because it's true, they're true, but to illustrate the importance of confidentiality, but to point out why that icebreaker is so, so important to develop that trust and rapport. And of course, if I'd have gone onto LinkedIn or something like that and said, oh yeah, I was at such and such an organization, these were the issues, well, that's madness, right? Plus professionally unacceptable. So of course I don't. But it is important that for the people listening to understand that these things really matter. And just try to put yourself in the position of that person who for 18 years had been traumatized, and that's the word, and they're her words, just by the word mediation. All right. So how could anybody as a mediator just turn up, say, hi, I'm your friendly mediator, tell me all about it? It's just not going to happen.
Yeah, thank you for that. And the other thing that I wanted to explore is the internal mediation aspects of it, because sometimes there are cases where internal mediation is absolutely suitable and it works. And then there are other cases that it wouldn't work for
Yes.
a number of reasons, anything from organizational culture, anything on who the actual internal mediators are, and the relationship. And that is key. And I think what you just described, I think the key is the relationship, or the perceived relationship that one of the participants thought the other participants had with the potential internal mediators or with the HR people within the organization. And as a result, felt that actually, I'm not going to speak to any of these people about the issues, or I'm not confident that they will be impartial. And I think that's the word. Even where I've seen resistance to employees sort of speaking to, and a lot of HR processes are the same. I mean, we sometimes get called in as independent consultants to go and deal with either some disciplinary grievances, investigations, etc., where especially people feel that anyone doing it internally may not be impartial. So
yeah, so there's a number of aspects there then, Mary. So again, in contrast to a lot of fellow workplace mediators, and particularly the lawyers amongst us, they require a detailed brief, right, from the organization, right, as if they were in court. Now, I do not have that at all. I do not want that. All I need to know is who the participants are, and then how I can communicate with them. We set that up. And now the reason for that is absolutely, I do not want to have any subjectivity, any bias come through, because what I learn in a great deal of depth, pretty much, is something that the participants have actually decided to share with me. All right. So there are no preconceptions. Another aspect of mediation, workplace mediation, where it completely differs from civil and commercial, is that what is said to me in an individual meeting is absolutely not shared with others. Now, again, there are other very large mediation or conflict resolution companies where that's not the case. They literally act as civil and commercial mediators. So they'll go to participant A and say, well, when we were speaking with participant B, this is what they've said. So they're almost doing like a shuttle, a Henry Kissinger's shuttle diplomacy. Now that doesn't happen, because the real power in the process, as we defined it by ACAS, is that the realization of quite often the same incidents, but been completely interpreted differently by people, comes out, and that's the emotional impact of the joint meeting. That's the first time that people have actually been listened to what the other persons have said, and then understood how, whether it's how an email was phrased or why an email was used rather than picking up the phone or going to someone and saying, let's have a cup of coffee. All those things have not occurred. And so there's an interpretation that individual participants put upon the same action. And of course, as a mediator, I've picked up all of those different perspectives, but I don't share them, because that's actually the point of the joint meeting, where people actually, I think I used that phrase early on, see each other as people, and they recognize that their interpretation of events, which is then mushroomed into a conflict, isn't necessarily their view. So in NLP, they talk about the map isn't the territory, right? So in other words, how we look at something is how we look at something. It's not how everyone looks at something. And so the emotion, to come back to your point, Charlotte, is intense. So quite often there can be tears, there's apologies, there's shaking hands, but you're actually seeing authentic rapport and people connecting at what I call at a human level that they haven't for years. So it's actually a wonderful feeling. You're actually seeing like a rebirth of a relationship. So it is absolutely intense. And of course, in that individual meeting, I prepare people, because that's the big hurdle that people are fearful of. So a combination of the ground rules, explaining how it will work, and the facilitated process, it all contributes to what is an intense and emotional situation becoming manageable, and then a positive solution and situation for previously conflicted people.
You've actually sort of just almost answered what my next question was going to be. Which
sorry.
No, it's absolutely fine, and it's actually quite nice, because how do people go from I'm absolutely terrified and there's no way that I'm going to sit in the same room, let alone have a dialogue with this person, to walking into that room, having that dialogue, and actually ending up in either a handshake, a hug, or whatever that relationship might look by the end of the process.
Yeah, and of course I'm very mindful of that. So in the individual meeting, once we've explored the issues and the perspective and the potential outcomes that person's looking for, then time is spent, and it's always time very well spent, to not to make assumptions about how they will feel about the situation you've described in a joint meeting, but I listen to what they've got to say and I deal with point by point. And so part of it, for example, is that there's a presentation. So we start off probably about 10 minutes or so, where individual participants will describe, if you like, their perspective on what's been going on. And part of the ground rules are respectful listening, and that includes no interruptions. And respectful listening is, as you'd understand, the body language, etc. And that's really important, because that's the beginning of the activity on a human level. But quite often, again, it's the first time that participants have been able to give their perspective to other people who they're in conflict with, for all the reasons you described earlier. They can't stand to be in the same space. And of course, I'm there to facilitate that, to ensure that things go appropriately. And it is an intense process, but it's a manageable process, and it's a necessary process, because people need to be able to share what's been going on for them, and to be able to say it directly, if you like, without fear of retribution, let alone physical violence. So it actually works. And so whilst it's the most challenging, I absolutely will do my level best to prepare people for how it will operate, and having all those guidelines, the process in place, it enables highly charged situations to be managed in a very positive and productive way.
Right.
I think sometimes people just don't realise the impact they have. And I think that can be quite enlightening, can't it? Because having the courage to come in and have those conversations and knowing that it's done in a safe space and a supported way, it means that actually they can say, you know, you made me feel this way, or I thought you thought this about me. And that can be quite enlightening because, you know, then someone sort of says, well, that never even occurred to me and I didn't realise I had that impact on you. So it's the first time often that impacts are actually discussed, isn't it?
Absolutely. And of course, that's why it's also really valuable for organisations to understand their role. So even if they've got OHU, welfare, or all those things, how that's delivered. So, for example, another person described a really intense situation and I said, right, so do HR know about this? No. I said, well, you need to be able to have a conversation. And this was a director. I said, so just get in touch with your senior HR person, say there's something extremely serious, you'd like a cup of coffee off site. And that sounds really straightforward. And then she said, I don't actually know who the HR person is. I've never met, we've never met anyone. We've never seen them. All you do is you email an inbox and then you get an email reply. So that organisation thinks they've got all this covered and it's madness. Right. So the potential impact is quite significant. When situations reach an employment tribunal, the business relationship between the litigant, if you like, the person who's raised the employment tribunal, who's unhappy about what's going on in the organisation, that business relationship is dead. There's all sorts of implications potentially for reputation, but beyond that as well is, let's look at costs, which aren't inconsiderable. So, say, for example, ACAS as an average described workplace conflict as being costed as something like £4,000 per employee in an organisation per year. So it's looking at management time, absences, recruitment, those sort of things. Now, for employment tribunals, you're then adding into the mix, at least from one side, probably the organisation, if not the litigant, the cost of legal representation. So employment lawyers I know have told me that for a very straightforward case, that's about £10,000. For a more complex, it's 50,000. It can go up to a lot higher. So that consideration, and we touched upon it about the business relationship, is really important. Is that the business relationship is repaired, fractured, it could be even broken in a unique way in mediation between people, and absolutely with the organisation, because they stay. Because the costs and consequences of quiet quitting, people going sick, people resigning, etc., is enormous, and it doesn't work, because that's an admission of failure. So that earlier recognition of that initial conversation, and if it needs then to go to a mediation process to deal with the conflict, because quite often when I get involved, this is a result of people raising grievances, and then HR will suggest, well, can we do a bit of mediation? And these are repairable, and then people apologise. But I always feel the earlier the conversation, the better.
Right. Thank you very much, Tony. I think it's an interesting topic that we can go on and sort of explore all sorts of angles from it, and definitely worth revisiting on another episode to talk about maybe specific aspects of it. And we always end with, or we mostly end with, giving your top 3 tips to anyone listening or watching on conflict resolution and how they may sort of avoid it or go about resolving it.
Okay, so so these are aspects, if I may, I'll make 4.
All right, you can be generous.
Thank you. So this is both for managers and for HR colleagues, because the foundations of so much workplace conflict is the fact that so many managers, for various reasons, lack of support, training, etc., do not know how to manage people effectively and fairly. That's the fundamental cause of the huge amount of workplace conflict. So the 4 aspects are: number 1, know your people. Number 2, be authentic. Number 3, do not procrastinate over taking difficult decisions. And number 4 is be consistent. So with those principles in mind, that will make any intervention, any discussion about areas of potential conflict so much easier. So, for example, if managers exhibit those traits, those characteristics, the people they're responsible for, they will have earlier conversations. They will also know if as you suggested earlier, Mary, something's not quite right. They'll know about it. Even more powerful, and this is an experience I had in the police, where people would come to me and say, we don't know what it is, but there's something not quite right with X. And then I would obviously start the process of conversing, etc. Of course, not mentioning why I'm doing it in the first place. So the earlier the conversation, the better. And, that phrase I talked about, transforming the difficult conversation into healthy dialogue, is absolutely right. Everything can't be sweetness and light, but it's far better to have that earlier conversation before things get entrenched, and then there's wider options to actually mitigate those effects.
Right.
Thank you very much. Great tips. I think you're right. Some of this comes back to managing, helping and supporting line managers as well to do their role, from an organisational perspective. And so thank you ever so much. Really interesting conversation. Having done, I'm not a trained mediator, but having done some facilitated conversations to try and sort of resolve issues in small teams, I find it a fascinating topic. But also understand, how hard it is to be involved in it and how stressful it can be for those involved. So I think any approach that makes that better, easier, and creates a win is absolutely a win for HR and small businesses. Absolutely. So well done. Thank you. Thank you for sharing your expertise. We always appreciate, we have some amazing guests, and it's lovely to hear your approaches and what you do. So thank you for that today. So thank you for your time today. Thank you everybody to listening. As always, look out for our next episode. If you would like to come on and be a guest as well, same as Tony has done, then you are more than welcome to make contact with us at hrvoices@hrindependence.co.uk, and we look forward to seeing and speaking with you next time. So thanks for listening. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of HR Voices. If you have a topic you'd like us to cover or would like to be a guest, we'd love to hear from you. Connect with us on social media or email us at hrvoices@hrindependence.co.uk. Tune in next time.